I am here with Thomas Mann. Sir, thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be with you.
So I had first heard of you from a Washington Post op-ed that you had done back in 2012 that was called "Let's Just Say It: The Republicans Are the Problem." That was taken to be like a bold statement at the time. Could you just say what was the motivation for writing that op-ed?
I'd be happy to. The piece itself was a long Sunday Outlook article in the Washington Post, and the editor of that section, Carlos Lozado, was the person who wrote that headline. We weren't clever enough to do it ourselves. The piece went viral, reaching an unbelievably large audience. I think at that time, 7 years ago, it ended up being the most read opinion piece in the Post that year. It was adapted from a book Norm Ornstein and I had written and was to be published the following week, called "It's Even Worse Than It Looks: How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism." This is a book which followed years of studying, observing, and writing about Congress and more broadly the state of American politics. Our previous book, immediately before that one, was called "The Broken Branch." So you get the idea that we were becoming concerned about the state of American politics. I think the piece and the book attracted a wide readership because Norm and I, Norm at AEI and myself at Brookings, were known as nonpartisan observers and students of American politics and the Congress in particular. That doesn't mean each of us individually didn't have his own political views, but we believed our sort of professional position was to strive for the truth and some insight and follow that wherever it took us, not to avoid controversy. And the argument we made in the book was a subtle one. It suggested the dysfunctional politics we were living through was a potent brew of a number of factors. One, of course, the ideological polarization of the parties, combined with their newly intense competitive position for control of the major institutions of American democracy. Then a tribal politics fueled by partisan and social media, which intensified a visceral hatred of the opposition party, and finally, and the most controversial of observations, that the extreme positions and actions of one of our two major political parties, namely the Republican Party, had severely weakened American democracy. We felt that the GOP had radicalized, but that we were caught in a situation where the, if you will, mainstream media felt obliged to find safe haven, and both sides do it, and the partisan media was dominated by talk radio, and then Fox News, and ultimately social media, and that people were not really getting the story of what was happening in our politics. And that's why, and sorry for this long answer, but
No, you're good. That's
it
did you sorry. Go ahead.
it led to the most quoted line in the book, which still is picked up and resonates. Let me just read it for you from the book. The Republican Party has become an insurgent outlier, ideologically extreme, contemptuous of the inherited social and economic policy regime, scornful of compromise, unpersuaded by conventional understanding of facts, evidence, and science, and dismissive of the legitimacy of its political opposition. In other words, we have a political system that depends upon two major parties, one conservative, one liberal or progressive, each of whom respects the system itself and takes their opposition as adversaries but not enemies, and are prepared to and have enough overlapping interests that they're willing to engage in negotiation and compromise and carry on with the work of American government. And that had ended, and that was the major source of our governing problems.
Did you hear from anybody in either party about your work?
Oh boy, did we! But it's interesting in how we did. Obviously, Democrats were delighted with the argument, especially it coming from us. We heard from a lot of Republicans, but almost all of them were former Republican officials. They had been elected to the House, the Senate, state office, but had either retired or been defeated. They said, "You're absolutely right. That's exactly what's happened to our party. It was simply impossible to operate in that setting and environment anymore." Those in Congress were uncomfortable with it and mainly ignored it. But I give you two examples. One, a Republican congressman, a moderate from Northern Virginia, Tom Davis, who chaired the Oversight Committee for a while, told us a story of campaigning for election. The Democratic candidate had gotten hold of our book and held it up or made reference to it, the problems of the Democratic Party, and Davis pulled out his own copy and read from the pages in which we discussed in a very favorable light the way in which he had led his committee and governed. So it wasn't a anti-Republican track more broadly. It was, we thought, an accurate description of reality, and Davis was very different from the new breed of Republicans coming into the party. And the other example would be from Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, who hated the book and
Of course.
and he preferred to ignore it, but Harry Reid, then the majority leader, just couldn't resist when he had control of the floor, which was basically whenever he wanted to occasionally read from the book. And I think the third time he did it, McConnell just exploded with an attack against us and denounced us. Some years later, he appeared at AEI, which is, you know, it's a legitimate think tank, but tends to attract conservatives. And Norm was in the audience and asked a question, and McConnell sort of attacked him viciously because he wasn't holding to the party line. So it certainly was an irritant for the Republicans and a fine gift for the Democrats among elected politicians. But I think in the broader public, it really struck pay dirt because people and many groups, nonprofits and reform groups, all believed if we just brought the two parties together and taught them how to be more civil to one another and set up retreats based on bipartisan participation and so on, that would take care of it. And this was a dagger in the heart of those sort of good government efforts to try to deal with our politics.
Now, at what point, because you see a lot of people who are quote unquote never Trump Republicans who say that, oh, this man has broken our party, but clearly you identified a trend well before 2016. At what point did the party begin to drift into becoming an insurgent outlier?
It's an excellent point. Donald Trump was a consequence, not a cause of the radicalization of the Republican Party. But being in the White House, he was in a position to capitalize on his own ambitions and basically became the Republican Party. But it began decades earlier. There've been some good histories of the Republican Party that, you know, go back to the 50s and some of the debates between the Bill Buckleys and moderate Republicans who were uncomfortable with what was happening to the party. It actually picked up speed and momentum in the Goldwater candidacy in 1964. Even though Goldwater was crushed in the general election, he won the Republican presidential nomination, and that was the beginning of really of serious organizational efforts by the right in American politics. And shortly thereafter, really, it was the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the reshuffling of the coalitional bases of the two parties by race, by religion, and more so as well on economic policy. But it was mainly racial, social, cultural divides that began to become more distinctive. Interest groups which heretofore had worked with both parties picked one. So, for example, the evangelical Christians really saw, after actions in the 70s with Roe v. Wade and then efforts to limit the deductibility and operation of Christian schools, they decided to place their weight with the Republican Party, and after that, those fighting for access to abortion, pro-choice forces went with the Democrats, even though Jimmy Carter had actually won the support of people who opposed abortion when he ran back in 1976. So it was beginning. There was also a foreign policy dimension to it after the McGovern candidacy and the opposition to the war in Vietnam, so that the kind of neoconservative foreign policy, the conservative social bases, and then with supply side economics, Grover Norquist, and the pledge that ultimately all Republicans were expected to sign of no tax increases, period, ever, under any circumstances. And that, so you saw a sorting of the parties. Race has, of course, always been a dominant factor in American politics. But for a number of decades, the parties were not defined by their views on race. In fact, during much of Jim Crow, the Democrats had a strong support among the Dixiecrats, the conservative segregationist Democratic senators from the South, and Republicans still had vestiges of Abraham Lincoln and the effort to end slavery, free the blacks, and treat them as legitimate citizens in the country. But suddenly, the racial dimension began to define the parties, and that made it sort of much more difficult for the parties to find common ground. So you add that the economic policy, no new taxes ever, sort of anti-government efforts, not sort of negotiating differences, but really looking to repeal much of the Great Society, the New Deal, and back to Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. So that was the context in which the broader political environment was set. But then after Ronald Reagan's election as president and the embrace of supply side economics, Americans for Tax Reform, Norquist effort, you found a number of Republicans really becoming much more activist ideologues. And perhaps the best example and the most important was Newt Gingrich, who on his third run for the House won the 1978 contest for his Georgia congressional district and came in really as a Rockefeller Republican, but quickly saw with Reagan's elections and developments in the party that that the obvious direction for the Republicans was to move to the right, but more importantly, it was to gain the majority in the House, which seemed like it was a God-given right of Democrats to hold. They held the majority in the House for all but two Congresses between 1930 and 1994. It was just stunning,
Wow.
and at that time, it was it was over a quarter of a century since they had been in power even for a single term. So Gingrich decided, and this was just a critical change in our politics, that the way for the Republicans to get back in power was probably to have a Republican in the White House, a Democrat in the White House, and then really use that as a basis of demonizing government and the crooked, swampy city on a hill dominated by Democrats, and so he led an effort, and it was very creative, and I can know him very well. He participated with Norm and me, and along with some other members of the class of 1978, in a series of dinner meetings at which we tried to understand how they were adapting to their new roles as members of the House. And Gingrich, from the first dinner, outlined a strategy of regaining majority control by delegitimizing the Democratic Party. It actually scared some of the others, including Dick Cheney, who was also a freshman Republican in that class, as well as, of course, the Democrats. But it took Newt 16 years, but his Conservative Opportunity Society, his effort to recruit candidates, to come up with language to use to delegitimize them, see them as crooked and corrupt. It was an effort, and that was the time then that talk radio really got going. Rush Limbaugh was a huge force, had a big audience. TV, Fox News, and social media came much later. It began with talk media, and Newt's leadership in the Republican Party to raise hell, to refuse to negotiate and compromise, but to draw the line, and that really helped fuel what was happening in the external political environment, to divide the parties, to eliminate the overlapping cleavages that help bring the parties together on important matters, and began to break down the whole idea of institutional loyalty and the importance and prerogatives of the first branch of government, quite apart from one's party. And then we got negative partisanship and affective sort of tribal reactions. It affected the Democrats as well. The polarization involved both political parties, but the Republicans stood out. They had an incentive, they thought, to regain power in Congress by basically turning it into a war, a political war at every stage, at every minute, and I think that's how it began.
Okay, so there has been gridlock in Congress before, right? So I mean, and some would say like the system is designed for gridlock, and I suppose in some ways you're pointing to that in the title of your book, where you say the constitutional system collides with the uh, radicalization of the party. Why is the dysfunction today different than it's been in the past?
We have had periods of polarization before when the parties were distinctive. We had some of that actually in the early 1800s, and then in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century, and tensions, were severe. The period, of course, leading up to the Civil War was particularly divisive and ended in a bloody war. So I don't mean to suggest that we've had peace and harmony in our politics. It's just that the sorting of race had a good deal to do with it, and then accompanied by strong cultural and social attitudes, made negotiations between the parties much more difficult in this particular period of time. Political scientists have done research and found that divided party government doesn't necessarily mean dysfunctionality. We've had periods when substantial legislation was passed during this, but that was because cross-party coalitions were possible. You could argue that before this current period, we had a four-party system. We had liberals and conservatives in both parties, and that introduced an element of flexibility that made cooperation quite possible. Remember, the parties were not even mentioned in the Constitution. The framers were fearful of divisions and groups that might break the system apart. So they set up a system of separated institutions with checks and balances, and a federal system distributing party power across layers of government that with incentives for members of each of these levels and institutions to maintain the authority and power identified in the Constitution, and in that process prevent extreme actions and have the incentives to build broad majorities across sections of the country and classes. Of course, that didn't count racial minorities or women or non-property holders initially, but over time the franchise spread, and the system tried to adapt. Parties began soon after the first presidential administration and Congress were convened. Politicians in all democracies have discovered a need to form political parties to attract support, to build coalitions, and to govern. And the U.S. was no different. But when in our system, without the safeguards that exist, say, in a parliamentary system, where governments can fall, and where a majority of members of the parliament is actually required for a prime minister to be elected and to sustain his or her position in government. it was a combination of the extreme hyper partisanship with our particular constitutional system that created the difficulties of recent years.
How much did climate denialism factor into your argument about the Republican Party?
Um, Certainly, when we mentioned the Republicans as not accepting conventional understandings of fact, evidence, and science, we were suggesting that in this sorting, all of the or most of those with sort of traditional understandings, religiously based of reality, and those with strong conservative religious views suggest that climate might be a part of that. But we still a decade ago, Republicans, the Republican Party included a number of people who recognized climate change as a big problem and the need to do something about it. Remember, conservationism was initially a Republican issue. Teddy Roosevelt was the champion, and the party long showed a concern for the land and the climate. But I think it was a combination of the anti-science views combined with the efforts of the fossil fuel industry, including in a political sense, most importantly, the Koch brothers and the development of an organization which changed over time, but eventually became Americans for Prosperity, and they linked up with other fossil fuel corporate executives and others, and became a real political force within the Republican Party. And starting not in Washington but in the states, they founded something called ALEC, which was the American Legislative Exchange Council, in which they began developing model legislation and lobbying in the states. And that's where some of the climate change denialism began, so that by moving into then the Obama years, you began to see national Republicans begin to adopt that position as well.
And I'm obviously not a politician, but I imagine that people in politics are similar to people in business, and that they respond to incentives. What is the incentive structure in place that leads Republican politicians, even ones who are uncomfortable with where the party has gone, to continue to drift farther to the right?
It's a combination of a desire for re-election and a desire for power, and that means they have to satisfy the constituencies they face, and in most cases that's a party constituency. The districts and states increasingly became one-sided. The general elections had a given outcome, and so the only concern was with primary elections. They were few and far between as far as serious challenges, but threat was increasingly there, and that's because the infrastructure of the party developed in a way that the right and the extreme right really dominated the efforts at the local level. The development of the Tea Party and in Obama's first year in office was a major organizational effort that reinforced that, and there were some visible elections where incumbents were defeated, initially nominating bad candidates who lost the Democrats, but ultimately creating a condition where it's not that that Republicans are challenged all over the place, but it's that they feel obliged to be on the team so as not to be challenged, and that's an important part of it. The second is that their election alone is not sufficient. They don't want to spend their lives, most of them, just doing constituent service. They want to run the institutions of the House and the Senate and be chairs of committees and subcommittees and be in a position to make a difference, and therefore the incentives were there for Republicans to go with the flow, and that's true of a number of those Republicans who had taken climate change seriously to just get on board. That was now a part of the party platform, and that's the way it would be. Democrats. Same thing happened with Democrats, say, on abortion. Democrats used to be divided on abortion, but as Republicans began to capture the pro-life movement and take more restrictive stands, it became more difficult for pro-life Democrats to survive in the party. And now there's only a handful of them. That's partly because Catholics, who were a major source of opposition to the legality of abortion and the availability to it themselves, rank and file Catholics came to be more supportive of it. In any case, the incentives were there. Remember, it's re-election, and it's a desire to be a part of the majority party, because party matters much more in legislating. That's where the power is and the resources to make a difference.
Do the developments in the Republican Party relate at all to the global rise of the far right, places like Italy and France and Poland?
The most recent manifestations of them do. But it began long before that. There's always been a radical right in American politics, but and mostly, but not always, the radical right was associated with the Republican Party, but it was a relatively minor force. Occasionally, the John Birch Society, Joe McCarthy, would be there, but they never became a dominant force in the party. In American politics, the extreme left and extreme right tended to be marginalized because of our two-party system and all the disincentives for additional parties to to form, organize, and get elected to office. So it's been around, and these these efforts were there, but certainly the economic conditions that are behind much of the radical populist movements around the world, that is technology, globalization, the deindustrialization, the greater returns to higher education, and the negative returns to those without, the tough times that many people suffered, the increasing importance of urban and rural divides. All of these were around for many years. In Europe, the refugee crisis, I think, fueled many of these efforts. We helped cause a lot of that with the war in Iraq and the complete disruption of the Middle East and Northern Africa, and the waves of immigrants. In the U.S., we had waves of immigrants in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and sort of hit a peak in the 20s, and it we passed stricter legislation, and the numbers really went down and became very low. But then starting in the 60s, we saw liberalized registration, immigration laws, and the numbers increased and moved up to from 4 to 14, 15 or more percent of the population, and so it became increasingly an issue here, but wasn't anything close to the pressure that was developing across the country. But I think certainly we've had populist efforts before. George Wallace was a major figure in the Democratic Party. He never won the nomination. He ran as a third party candidate and attracted substantial votes. Race was a big force with his, but you heard in his speeches much of today's right-wing populist talk about the elitists, the establishment, the working Joe not getting the attention of the pointy-headed intellectuals and professors who are running the Democratic Party, which since Franklin Roosevelt had been the natural home for working men and women, if you will. There are commonalities across the globe on this, but differences as well. Our particular form of government, which with separate elections for the executive and legislative branch, with single member first past the post electoral districts, therefore no proportional representation, created a situation where it was only the two parties here, unlike in Europe and other places where PR allowed coalitions to be built with parties and accommodations made.
Sorry, when you say PR, you mean proportional representation.
Proportional representation, yes, I'm sorry. So that if the majority party didn't win a majority, if no party won a majority, they had to negotiate with smaller parties, and that sort of led to some responsiveness to minority interest and ease the task of governing. But our system makes that very difficult. In some ways, getting out of this mess we're in right now would only happen, I think, under two circumstances. One, the Republican Party changes dramatically or is replaced. That last happened in 1860, and I don't believe there's much of a chance of that. But a couple of really bad electoral losses would probably incentivize those who don't agree with the direction the party has taken to try to change it. But perhaps more promising would be some form of proportional representation that would allow third parties to elect members of Congress that at a start would then create some kind of coalition building that might make governing a bit easier. In a sense, we could operate if both parties were somehow incentivized to not play to the far right or far left, but to be distinctive, to govern, but to govern in a constructive way. But that's really hard now, given the divides that exist. But we certainly see it happening in some lower levels of government, where the nature of the problems that, say, a city or a county is facing requires some pragmatic decisions, where the ideological incentives don't get the job done.
Do you believe that the filibuster should be eliminated? And maybe if you could explain a little bit about what the filibuster's function is in the Senate.
Sure. The framers, in writing the Constitution, allowed the House and the Senate to set its own rules, but provided for a supermajority requirement for certain things, like overriding a presidential veto or approving a treaty or expelling a member, and so on. They therefore demonstrating they assumed, as was true in all parliamentary bodies at that time, that majority rule would operate in both chambers of the House and the Senate, and they did at the outset. Both adopted a motion to call on the previous question, and that demands an immediate vote on the underlying legislation, and it only requires a majority to call the question. But in recodifying the rules of the Senate, Aaron Burr, Vice President and President of the Senate, didn't keep the previous question motion. So the Senate lost its ability by more majority votes to cut off debate and vote. So that over time, senators saw use this as a way of slowing down the rush to legislation, to preventing certain things from being voted on and therefore becoming law. There was simply no way to cut off debate if senators wanted to continue it. That was ended in the lead up to World War One, lead up to the U.S. entry into World War One, when Woodrow Wilson led a campaign to change the rules of the Senate. They did, and it provided for cloture, which allowed a supermajority of members to cut off debate and proceed. After that time, there were many fewer efforts at filibuster. Happened under civil rights legislation, through the Jim Crow era, and a number of other important matters, but it existed, and as the parties became sorted and more polarized, and saw that legislating was an opportunity for campaigning, for gaining the upper hand, it started to be used as a weapon, and eventually the requirement was changed from 2/3 of the senators to 60 senators, 3/5, to pass cloture. As the system became more competitive, as Republicans won control, and control changed between the parties more, it became harder and harder, and so the opposition party was able to use the filibuster to defeat the cloture motions, and over time we had the routinization of the filibuster, such that all a member had to do was indicate his opposition to a unanimous consent agreement. That is, the Senate often proceeded to business, to dealing with the law by unanimous consent, because otherwise a member could start talking and delay any efforts to do it. But suddenly you got word out that they were going to object, and suddenly the Senate became very different, and cloture motions had to be filed every time there was even a threat of a filibuster, and it became a real weapon. Now the Senate has made a couple of changes, not by formally changing the rules, but by changing Senate precedent, such that now you can't filibuster on appointments to the courts, and now including the Supreme Court and to the executive branch. There's still means of slowing it down, and there is a provision, and this is complicated, I know, but a provision whereby certain kinds of pieces of legislation operate under different rules that have limited time for debate, and that also slows down the filibuster. What it doesn't do yet is allow a simple majority in the Senate to pass substantive legislation that doesn't deal with budget matters. And now there's a question of whether that should be changed. There's no need for it to be change. The Republican Party right now has the majority in the Senate, but there's a Democratic majority in the House, and so it wouldn't do them any good, even though they have the president in their corner. If Democrats were to win in 2020 and the presidency and control of both the House and the Senate, I think there's a reasonable chance they would get rid of the filibuster again through precedent, not rules, because it takes a supermajority even to change the rules. But there's a way of doing it. But it could always be changed back at any time by another majority overturning that precedent. So the answer is it becomes, as President Obama discovered in his first term before the Republicans took control of the House, that it made a huge difference in trying to get things done. But when the Republicans had a full divided government for 2 years in 2017 and 18, the only thing they were able to get was a big tax cut for the most part. There were sufficient divisions in the party that made that impossible. So the answer is Democrats may do it. Senators are reluctant to give up the ability to slow things down and use it as a bargaining chip to accomplish other things. So there are some institutionalists who would prefer to keep it. But my guess is the parties are so polarized. There's such a strong feeling about among Democrats what has been done contrary to their party's views, that they could very well do it. But I don't think it would necessarily ease matters entirely. There are some more conservative Democrats still around, like Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who might object if the majority is very narrow.
And I don't want to take up too much of your time, so last question I wanted to ask you was, you wrote in an op-ed in 2017 that perhaps Trump will be a net positive for American democracy in that he'll jolt citizens to action. It's 2019 now. Do you still feel that way?
I was being unusually hopeful, but I went back and read that piece, and I really stand by every word of it, because I was really reflecting on the importance. If the public didn't like what it had produced in 2016, the best way to reflect that would be in the midterm elections of 2018. And we saw massive mobilization, the most substantial increase in turnout across the board, including among young voters, that we had ever seen in one election. Turnout increased by over 10 percentage points, and among some groups increased 15 or 20%. It ended up producing a Democratic wave election that gave the House to the Democrats, and not the Senate, because of the particular seats that were up were in red country, and it was too difficult a task for them. But the Democratic House has made a huge difference. It's why the abuses of Trump, and the enabling of those by the Republican Party has led to an impeachment inquiry and substantial success in limiting, at least in a legislative sense, what Democrats believe would be damage to the Republic. But obviously, they can't do anything of a positive sort without controlling entirely both branches of government. So, I would argue, if our democracy is to be preserved and retained and protected, if we're to fight back against the norms that Trump has instituted and Republicans in Congress have gone along with, it will require that kind of mobilization in 2020. So I think just as the 2018 election was absolutely critical to preserving our democracy, it was a necessary but not sufficient condition. The only hope is until the Republican Party changes is for Democrats to win control and to carry out a program that is responsive to the whole country, and thereby somehow avoid the usual midterm loss and a Republican majority again. That is, we're going to have a period of governing where the public once again feels the government is on their side. Whether that will happen is somewhere between a pipe dream and a reasonable hope, but it would certainly include the kind of actions that by the public that I referred to in that op-ed, and then it will take some hard work to figure out how to make our democracy work again.
Well, on that note, Thomas, thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure talking.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, take care.
Thank you to Thomas Mann, and thank you for listening to Dunk Tank. I'm Duncan Gammy. See you next time.